Welcome to Yankees League the One YouTube channel. If this is your first time on my YouTube channel, please subscribe to my YouTube channel by clicking on the red subscribe button down below and turn on the bell icon. Tell me what you think about this video in the comment section.
Good morning again, and if you've just tuned in, this Let the People Talk 29 years on. When you bring a distinguished and respected state council to the program, you immediately know that something is important, something is cooking. After weeks of uncertainty, the government has finally got the cat out of the bag. And yes, it intends amending what it calls contentious issues, contentious clauses. And this is the focus of Let the People Talk with my guest, State Council Musa Mwenye. Good morning, State Council, and welcome.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you, and congratulations for your several years of service. We need to recognize steadfast people like yourself. You've given a lot to this country, and we appreciate you.
I'm humbled, State Council. State Council, surely long before the announcement of the intended amendments, you must have known that this was going to happen.
Yes, and I think the starting point for me is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I was interestingly going into the archives of my comments, and I found my comments of the 28th of September 2007.
Amazing.
And 18 years plus ago, I said this, and I want to read them if you
Please do.
I was commenting about the constitutional to participate in the National Constitutional Conference in its current form. And in a telephone interview from London, I was being reported.
Wow.
Mwenye said the current framework of the NCC had not been handled with sensitivity and consensus, which should accompany the constitutional making process. And I was quoted as saying, I've been away for almost a month now. I'm aware that LAS will be meeting on Friday to make its stand on the NCC. I'm confident that whatever decision the association will take will be made after a sober reflection on the long-term repercussions on the reputation and integrity of the association. And then I said, my prediction is that any constitution produced by the current process will have to be redone, and therefore will be a waste of national resources. I was extremely prophetic then. And what hurts me is we are still talking about the same thing. As a country, we don't seem to learn from our past mistakes. This was my comments in 2007. And it culminated, 3 years after this, we had the attempted constitutional review and the draft constitution of 2010 under the MMD. That failed in Parliament, of course, and my prediction was prescient. In 2019, I made my comments. Not only did I talk about the constitutional review process, the infamous Bill 10, I actually went to court with my brother Mtembonchito to represent Chama Fumba, who is now PS, popularly known as Pilato, against that particular constitution bill. And we are now back to this conversation. Sadly, Ambassador, the Bill 10 constitutional review process is much, much better than what we are seeing now. That's the sad thing. There are professionals within the Ministry of Justice. I know them because I worked with them. I don't know why they are not being listened to. I know that they know that process was better. Why was that process better? I'm not talking about the content. I'm talking about the process. I oppose that process. I oppose the content. But it was better than what we have now. We've been given 2 flyers. One with the content, the other with the process.
Wow.
That's what we are dealing with. The Bill 10 process was preceded by a Siavonga process, where secretary generals of political parties met and tried to agree on the process. After that, if you remember, we had the National Dialogue Forum. I'm holding in my hands now the National Dialogue Constitution, Electoral Process, Public Order and Political Parties Act number 1 of 2019. So even the Bhutan process had an act of parliament which guided the procedure. It had an independent body that recommended the provisions. It didn't come from government.
Yeah.
It came from the National Dialogue Forum, which was headed by Professor, I think it was Mwanalushi, Muyunda Mwanalushi. The secretary was Patrick Chisanga. It was a broad-based body, but we opposed that. In this case, everything is government-driven. We have from time immemorial agreed as a country. And I started that conversation with President Monawasa. The NCC was born out of almost a confrontational conversation I had with the president on the phone when he called me, in which I think I convinced him that the government should never be the one to come up with a white paper and recommend provisions, because the Constitution is a people's document. And that is why the NCC was set up. Broad-based group of people which comes up with recommendations and speaks for the masses.
Yeah.
That is preceded by broad consensus, interpretation of clauses into the 7 major languages, and engagement of the people at different levels. The National Dialogue Forum attempted this as well, followed this well-settled precedent of constitutional making. Now what we see is a flyer on the content and another flyer on the process. It's not enough. The government is driving the process from A to Z. The only period which is publication of the bill for consultation. What form will the consultation take? What metrics will we use to see whether there's been enough consultation? What if we oppose and the majority of the people don't want these clauses? How then will the government deal with that? So that is why I say, Bhutan, as bad as it was, we opposed it. The process for its formulation was much, much, much more consultative than what we have now.
We'll be going through these contentious issues very shortly, State Council. The million-question question is, these are the people who were there when Bill 10 was being discussed. They opposed it vehemently.
Yeah.
This is a government which promised to enhance democracy. What has triggered this?
I'm not sure, but I do know that historically and personally, I think that we should treat all amendments that come shortly before elections suspiciously. The history of this country shows that whenever governments insist on amendments before elections, they have a bearing. You remember that in 1996, we had the infamous parentage clause. That constitution was amended. Why? To bar Dr. Kaunda from standing in the election by the MMD then. We saw the 2010 proposed amendments by the MMD government. Again, it was shortly before the 2011 elections. Fortunately, that one failed.
Yeah.
We saw the Bill 10 process in 2019. Again, even if there was a semblance of consultation, we opposed that. Why? It was a fruit bowl of provisions. A lot of them were good. But there were sad provisions like the coalition clause, which was meant to save the government at that time. That a losing presidential candidate could get into a coalition with other parties to garner the numbers. It was meant to rescue. So you don't look at the majority of good clauses if there is even one bad clause, because one clause can unravel the whole of our democracy. It can unravel the whole of our constitutional order. Yeah, so I can't answer that question in a straight way. All I can tell you is that it's very sad that successive governments don't learn from the mistakes of the past. And it's our job as citizens to continue advising privately and publicly.
Having said that, State Council, there's a divided, group, so to say. Yes, some are supporting the amendments, some are not supporting the amendments. Before we go to those, contentious, issues, but the question is, why didn't they do this when they came into office? I'm talking about the timing here.
Yeah. I think there are two issues. I think it's the how and the when. How do we do the process? Constitutional amendments and the constitutional review process, if meant to enhance the rights of the people, if it is meant to improve our democracy, is always welcome. In principle, enhancing the constitution to make it better must always be supported. But we must keep a keen eye on how it is done. The process is very important. I've already said that we oppose the Bill 10 process, but it was much better than what we are seeing now. It was more consultative because there was an act of parliament that guided the process. There was a broad-based group that included several stakeholders that came up with the provisions. It wasn't come up from Ministry of Justice. It was formulated by the National Dialogue Forum, which was headed by Professor Muyunda Mwanalushi, and the secretary was Patrick Chisanga, Mr. Patrick Chisanga. And this broad-based group came up with these provisions that were handed over to the line ministers who presented them to Parliament. So for me, the issue is the how. The process is very important.
Right.
The current process is rushed. It is entirely driven by the government. When you look at the constitutional roadmap that we have been given, there is no place for a broad-based group that will consider. First of all, the constitutional amendment recommendations are coming from the government. The process of consultation is preceded by the publication of a bill. Previously, Bill 10 and the 2010 amendments presented by the MMD government were not formulated by the government. The bill came out of the consultation, not the consultations coming after the bill is produced. In this case, we have the consultations coming as part of publication of the bill for the amendment in Parliament. So we need to be very clear that what is happening now is unusual. It is not what we usually do in constitutional making in this country. In the past over 20 years, what we have done is let a broad-based group come up with the constitutional provisions. That's what happened under the National Dialogue Forum with Bill 10. That's what happened under the National Constitutional Conference with the Constitutional Amendment Bill of 2010. In this case, there is publication of a bill which is headed to Parliament, and as part of that parliamentary enactment process, the people are consulted. Now, you have already started the enactment process. You have already drafted the bill. Where is the people's feedback? Where is the input? Where is the bottom-up approach? And we need to rethink this process. In principle, constitutional review is good.
If it is unusual, State Council, what happens now? The bill has been, published.
It's not too late for the government to listen to us, the people. It's not too late for the government to look into this process and rethink it. We all make mistakes. Sometimes we may have been advised wrongly. Sometimes we may have misspoken. It may be that this process is got good intentions, but let us give it the legitimacy by doing the right thing as we have done in the past. Let us follow the well-settled traditions of constitutional making in this country, which were formulated after years of contention. After we quarreled for several years, I was part of the Oasis Forum. People like Mrs. Emily Skazwa, if you remember,
Yes, I did.
the Speaker of the National Assembly, the Right Honorable Neri Muti, Laura Miti, the late Ingutu Mutembo, Bishop Mususu, Reverend Japheth Njovu. We worked hard to fight for this particular process to be at least people-driven in terms of formulation and adoption of the Constitution. This is a well-settled process. We must not change it now.
Yeah. The president has always said, State Council, that no one should be left, behind. Why has he changed course?
I am not even faintly qualified to speak for him, Ambassador.
Yeah.
But I can say that with matters of the Constitution, development, poverty, it helps to listen to the wider population. And I think the advisors will do well to help in this regard, because presidents are busy. Sometimes they are preoccupied with so many issues. And I think it's incumbent upon those people who handle presidents to insist on some of these things. And I think there is still time. There is still time for us to reform it now.
Absolutely.
If we start the process now, remember that the constitutional review process that started in 2007, I was giving my comments that I've read on the 28th of September 2007. The bill was only presented in 2010, and President Mwanawasa had even died by then. So a process of constitutional making it takes long. Now, there are people who have said we don't need a broad-based group because it's not making the new constitution. Even the 2016 constitution is not a new constitution. It's amendments, because this is the 1991 constitution as amended. In fact, it bears tenets of previous constitutions, even up to the 1964 constitution. The only way you can come up with a completely new constitution is through what is called the Constituent Assembly, which would be constituted to enact it as well. But right now, we have amendments. Now, the Bill 10 itself was amendments.
Yeah.
There was a 2016 constitution, if you remember, that was signed by President Edgar Lungu. In 2019, they brought amendments in terms of Bill 10, but they still followed the broad-based group through the National Dialogue Forum, whose procedure was guided by an act of Parliament in terms of composition, in terms of how to come up with the recommendations, in terms of resolution, and these were from church mother bodies, from government institutions, from civil society generally. That was the composition. But what we did is, when we analyzed what came out of that group, we saw that there were problems in Bill 10. And when we go now to the content of the current recommendations, there are problems there too, quite apart from the process.
Yeah.
There are problems in the content.
Can you go through, for the sake of our listeners, so that they appreciate these contentious issues, go through each one of them and tick whether there's reason to amend?
First of all, I've said in the past, and I'll say it again, this constitution, the 2016 constitution as amended, is the best constitution we've had. I mean, let's be settled about that. From 1964 to now, we have never had such a progressive document. There have been attempts to rubbish this document. There have been attempts to caricature it as a bad document. That is simply not true. And I'll say why I'm saying this. If you remember, Ambassador, we never had a running mate clause. Now, the president in waiting, the vice president, who, if anything happened in the office of the president, becomes president, is directly vetted by the people. We campaigned for that clause. We fought for it for many years. We got it in the 2016 constitution. The second clause was the 50% plus one majoritarian election clause for the president. The first one is this proposal to remove the limit of nominated members of parliament. Currently, the constitution itself says this limit will be removed, number one. Number two, that the number of nominated members of parliament will not be contained in the constitution, but it will be now contained in an act of parliament. What are the implications of this? It means that the threshold for changing the number moves from 2/3 of the National Assembly to half. So it is easier to change the number every time.
Wow.
Meaning, if any incumbent has a problem with, for example, changing the constitution, and he doesn't have the 2/3 majority, okay, assuming that an incumbent says, I don't want the term of office to be 5 years, or I should remove the 2-term limit, what an incumbent then would do is simply increase the number of nominated members by an act of parliament using a simple majority, over 50% of the votes in the National Assembly, which is passing a bill, and just a normal act. Nominate up to 40 members, get a majority, and change the constitution. This one clause alone can change the entire landscape of our democracy. Just this one clause.
Yeah.
As a Democrat, as a person who is a patriot, this can't be allowed to go through. There is no way, as democratic Zambia, we can have such a clause in the constitution. It is completely anathema to our values as a people who love our freedoms, who said no to Kaunda's Wamuyayaya syndrome, who brought in these clauses that limit the powers of the president a bit. I don't think we should have a lame duck president as a patriot.
All right, before you go to the second one, on that premise, if the incumbent decides, through parliament, through numbers, that he can change to the number they've been talking about, 7 years, how do you reconcile the date of elections, which is enshrined in the Constitution? How do you relate that?
And I need to clarify. I'm not saying that is the intention, okay? But I'm saying because when we enact a constitution, Ambassador, we must not enact it for good people. We must not, even if we think the current people in office are good, we must enact that constitution with the view that the worst person will one day occupy that office. When we have an Idi Amin in that office one day, will he take advantage of the clauses we are putting in the constitution now?
Are you saying that a good constitution guarantees a good government?
Correct.
And a good president?
Correct. It keeps bad tendencies at bay. It helps bad people behave better when they're in government. That is the intention of those clauses. So this removal of constitution, remember that we opposed Bill 10 because of one clause, at least for me. I didn't agree with the coalition clause.
Right.
Even if Bill 10 came out of a consultative process, which we may have not agreed with, but at least it abided by our conventions in this country on constitution making.
Right.
And it was formulated by a broad-based group of people, not the government. But even if that happened, there was this clause that was sneaked in, and it made the whole fruit bowl sour. You can have sweet fruits in a fruit bowl, but if one fruit goes sour, it spoils all of it. So this particular clause is problematic.